It lurks in the cracks and in the joints that we don't really see because it's built into the system.
You spoke French, but you went in with English books.
We're here together, and we need to work together.
I've had many things that have tried to take my momentum away from going where I wanted to go.
I left because of systemic racism.
Why is it that children on a playground all play together? They don't care if somebody's hair is curly or straight or blonde, or they all play together. And what happens between the primary grade and grade 12? What happens to those children if it's not coming from home, from the government, from all kinds of different sources that are all related to racism and discrimination?
Meet Clara. She and a group of people from all over Nova Scotia came together to discuss cultural diversity.
Through times in Acadie and Kaylee's in the glen, you may roam, but then you'll be back again at Compass pointing eastward where the journey ends, out in Canada's ocean playground, here in Canada's ocean playground.
The discussions were opened with an important ritual.
We're gathered together on someone else's land, and in this case, we're gathered together in Mi'kma'ki, unceded ancestral lands, which is more and a bigger piece that can be talked about, but is always centered around, when we bring it up, that we know there's some action in the naming of that.
With current technology, they could take a fresh approach. Using video conferencing, Mi'kmaq from Member 2 could chat with Acadians 400 kilometers away. White English Lunenburgers could get to know African Nova Scotians from East Preston.
Mi'kmaq come from an egalitarian society, so there's we each had our own roles, different but equal roles.
The French and Mi'kmaq were allies. I always say that, we're allies.
I like it, the party. Down our way, and when I was young, when Noretta Johnny opened her still, we danced. The folks on the other side of the dune, they did not like it, but it was just fun.
And the whole white privilege is, you want a quieter room, like farting in a tent. What?
Black Nova Scotians, we came out of Africa through the enslavement period, and to imagine that the gene pool that survived the Middle Passage, imagine the gene pool that survived the trek from the interior of Africa to the coast, that DNA is strong enough to withstand being on a ship with very little opportunity for anything other than being in a confined space for up to 8 weeks, to arrive in what they call the New World to survive. And that DNA bloodline is able to survive the enslavement period. That is part of who we are as African Nova Scotians.
When you look into the darkest night, and all you see is out of reach, don't you lose your focus in the blind. Just stop and think of me. Oh, just stop, say. Just stop and think of me. Oh, just stop. Just stop and think of me.
I asked them, what's the opposite of love? And they said, opposite of love is hate. And I said, no. My elders told me that. My elders said, no, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is fear.
Of course, any discussion of Nova Scotia's diversity has to look at systemic racism and discrimination. What is systemic racism? How do we recognize it? Are there solutions to this problem? Have a listen as our group of Blue Nosers sits down to discuss this universal issue.
I guess I would define it as really based on fear and ignorance, that people seem to, they don't understand sometimes that they are even being racist.
This is going to be looking at a raindrop in a typhoon storm, because there's so many examples.
So religion is not a very thing they're going to look for in their development. So we don't have that fabric. Remember, we all had that fabric, you know, whether we were religious or not, we all came into that fabric of right and wrong, and we all touched that fabric. I don't know if we have that anymore. I don't think young people have that fabric anymore. You know, I don't know.
We're going to need a lot more love, but we also need a lot more economic support for people at the bottom of the rung, because that is a form of discrimination. People cannot get out of that cycle. I also work with the St. Vincent de Paul Society. It doesn't end. I've been doing this for a number of years, and I'm starting to see kids and people, and they have nothing. They can't get ahead. There's no mechanism to get ahead. Every day is a struggle. And we're living in one of the richest countries in the world.
Yes.
And economic discrimination. I see it. I saw it in the school system every blessed day. I saw kids who wore the same thing every bloody day to school.
You know, and it's sad that in 2022, we're supposed to be in a world of human beings and common sense and love and all this, but there's so much hate, and our babies have got to walk around saying, why can't I be friends with somebody?
My good friend from Corpus Christi, Texas, says 50. He doesn't believe me. He says, I don't believe you play 15%. People would riot around here. Somebody would die. You know, what if the government said, we're going to eliminate every child under 15 is going to eat. It's a mandatory law, and they're going to charge us another % on our sales tax. Would we argue? No. So it's a solvable problem. I'm trying to figure out, what am I missing here?
Political will.
If somebody said to every one of us here, our taxes are going up 3%, we're going to pay 18%, but no kid will starve again in this province, what are we going to do? We'd say, that sucks, but let's do it.
We are 21 generations away from Christopher Columbus. 21 generations. Imagine how embedded, imagine how deep-rooted the notion of people being different is ingrained in who we are as human beings now. So over 21 generations, it means that I have been described in some circumstances as the skin color, especially in North America, as being aggressive, as being incompetent, as being lazy, as being not having the intelligence to be able to carry on. And so therefore they build all of the rest of societal's values going forward on that, because the thing that gets held up is to be white is the standard. Yeah. To be white is the way that things move through life, to be able to say that that's what it is. But those that resist that are oftentimes said, well, you're a troublemaker. No, that's just the way that the system is.
Systemic racism, to me, that's flipping the discrimination back to that, is a lack of freedom of choice. And that's just not fair for anyone.
I'm a person that I think comes from the simple life of a Black Canadian male. You know, I have perspective on situations and things, the police, that a lot of people look like me have. It's a different world. It's a different navigation for people of color than it is for, I think, people of the dominant culture. There's no question about it. The world's about opportunities and options. And then with that, we make choices and decisions. When you have limited options, then you have limited choices sometimes.
But as far as the racism part of it, I mean, very young. I mean, people started using the C word, a chink. And I won't use it again, but we'll call it the C word. That was a normal part of vocabulary.
Deb Beers, a white American, was horrified at the overt racism there. She became a Canadian citizen, thinking that Canada was a more racially tolerant society.
But then I found out, well, there's some bad things here too. It's not all Canada the good.
Many white English are not aware of just how prevalent racism is because they don't live it every day like Dolly. She says it is a misconception that Canada is less racist than the United States. It is simply just more subtle here.
So there's a difference. In the United States, when I go to the United States, when I go to every state, my family done it, I know where I'm wanted, where I'm not wanted, but here, you still got, the mask is still on.
It is so blatantly absence of the freedom of choice. There's no choice for everyone. There's only those within the respected and established society that are privileged to have freedom of choice. I know I look white. My mother was full Mi'kmaq, and her parents were full Native. And I, as a result, sometimes know what it's like to be discriminated against because I look white, though I'm not.
I acknowledge my white privilege and have slowly learned about it. I not only am white, but I was English in Quebec. So talk about ignorance. But I see two different kinds of systemic racism and discrimination. One is the intentional one of the people who fear that they're losing their white power. The other is very subtle, and it's through ignorance.
Also called structural racism or institutional racism, systemic racism is buried in every part of our lives because so much of what affects us is developed by white men.
So on a very much unconscious level, these rules, these restrictions, these practices, they've been around us for a very, very long while. And they become very exclusionary because we're seen as an afterthought. So when the Black community or when the Indigenous community pushes up against that system has a level of uncomfortability because the assumption is one size fits all. Mm-hmm. And we know that that's not the case. One size fits one. So when I have these conversations, when people talk about institutional racism, I try to start by talking about, think about what we already have in terms of who has advantages and who doesn't have advantages. So you don't have to use the word racism, just think about advantages and disadvantages.
High-tech companies started out run by and staffed by young white men. So when, for example, a camera phone was developed, it read and exposed white skin well, but had trouble recording the details of darker skin.
This poem is for my unsung heroes. Black and brown soldiers forgotten line by line where poppies are sold, and row by row in Flanders field where poppies grow as if their blood does not equally soak its petals. This poem is for the unsung heroes of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, those brave young men who cross states and provinces to enlist in an army whose first rule of recruitment is that all men must be white, to die for a country that still doesn't believe that they exist. This is for the unsung heroes, those Black Scotians, our brothers who traveled to Pictou and Truro to serve in a segregated non-combative unit. This is for those unsung heroes that were denied their right to fight for a country that denies them their rights daily.
Research labs studying health issues for years ignored sickle cell anemia because it didn't affect most of the white population. History in schools omits the facts of Black and Indigenous invention and heroism. Sometimes it is intentional, like it was when all Black soldiers were purposely taken out of the Victory March into Paris in the Second World War. But more insidious are the harder-to-prove biases. Banks that make it harder for a person of color to get a loan to start a business. Landlords who even today will not rent to African Nova Scotians. Some teachers who expect less of a student because of their race. Education itself, because it is developed by the majority, white educators, who themselves were given history that leaves out much of what really shaped our society.
Probably because of my upbringing, where I was brought up, and probably inherently there's aspects of that's racist. But I understand that and I get that. And I don't believe it, but it's the first thing that comes in my head and it doesn't come out of my mouth. My belief system has absolutely changed, but it's one of the first things that crossed my mind. So I use that statement by Shiraki Hale. I said, I say to people, don't let your first thought be your last thought.
My father, Charlie, wouldn't talk much about his father. He would just tell us that his father died of mental wounds. I found out that his name was Louis and that he and his two brothers had fought in World War I. I never knew their names because my father wouldn't talk much about it. I heard that they had fought at Vimy Ridge and that one of the brothers died over there, and my grandfather lost part of his leg. And being Mi'kmaq, they didn't have to go to war because conscription didn't apply to them. But they wanted to fight for Canada, so they signed up. My grandfather was underage, so they had to lie about his age so he could go with his brothers. He was buried, sorry about that, he was buried in the Catholic cemetery in Bridgewater, just up St. Philip Street. But we could never find his grave. But I later find out that because he was a Mi'kmaq, they wouldn't let him be buried inside the Catholic cemetery fence.
I see racism and discrimination built into our systems. It's built into our infrastructure. So infrastructure, our institutions, our schools, our medical, our media, all the things that make a society function. There's lots of racism and there's lots of discrimination on an individual basis. But historically, that racism was institutionalized. It was meant to make one group dominant, one group control another. And legislation and habits and customs racism and discrimination for Acadians often ends up being, for the most part, linguistic. You're left out linguistically, or you do not have rights linguistically because of legislation. So that's a big thing for me, and I know also for Clara, that want to have a living culture as opposed to a heritage. So in order to maintain a vibrant Acadian culture, it has to be a living culture, and that living culture is tied to language. There are other customs too, but it's really tied to language. So it's a little bit different for Acadians. I mean, an Acadian would be in a population of Caucasian people. You wouldn't know who is and who isn't. It's, to me, I see a lot of legalized discrimination because of laws in the past and maybe some that are presently on the books as well.
Didn't know my African language. Still don't learn it. I try to learn it. I do take a couple of courses, but that was taken from us.
It began really when Christopher Columbus landed on the shores here, but it began prior to that. At the time, Europe was all Christian and all the kings were under Catholicism. And at the time, the Pope was considered the King of Kings. So all the kings answered to the Pope. It began with the papal bulls of 1453. In particular, it was racism against Muslims. And one of the things it said was if people were not Christian, that they were not allowed to own land or actually have any rights to land. 1492, Columbus lands on the shores here. And at that time, there was another papal bull because they had found riches, in particular gold and silver. And so there's another papal bull in 1493 that says that if non-Christians cannot own land, non-Christians really have no rights. It's been used primarily to support decisions invalidating or ignoring Aboriginal possession of land in favor of colonial or post-colonial governments. It's also shaped how these governments treated and continue to treat Indigenous people through domination and dehumanization, and it gave rise to the myth of European superiority and supremacy.
A little bit of history. In 1604, the French government tells some of its peasants that they can come to the New World and they will be given land, which really wasn't right because it wasn't theirs to be given because it belonged to the Mi'kmaq people. But nevertheless, we know what colonization is all about. So, and then in 1608, they started bringing in women as well as men, and they established themselves in Port Royal. And from there, for over 100 years, they settled along the Minas Basin, Annapolis Valley, right up to Amherst and on into Prince Edward Island. Those were all Acadian villages. But I think it was 1710, the British government or the king wanted this land, and I won't go into many details, but anyway, things started there was unrest. And for about 40 years, the Acadian people who were law-abiding, their armory, their guns was only used for hunting. They didn't kill anybody. They weren't interested. They just wanted their language, which was French, their religion, which was Catholic, and to live side by side with the Indigenous people. That's all they wanted.
Amazing. I always find how rich everybody's story is. There's just so much content and so much to be admired and so much to be thankful for. And
very much.
I think that it's such a shame that so many of us don't hear other people's stories.
You cannot hate someone that you really know. If you really know their history and you know them.
You know, as a Brit, I've done several television shows that relate to the Acadians. And it always amazed me, speaking of racism, that I was welcomed with open arms, but my ancestry is such that I wouldn't be doing that. And just the same as when I've spoken to various elders, one in particular that I think of at Eskasoni, and I think if I'd gone through what you went through, I would have probably committed murder.
The losing of your mother tongue. Yeah. Like my father served in the Canadian Armed Forces and lived in Germany as what did you go over when you were 20? So 20 years old and had to 18. Oh, 18. Sorry, 18. Yeah. In 1959, Dad was in Europe, and then we went back as a family. And in order for us to survive, because I was young, I learned the language and I did the grocery shopping for Mom, and I communicated to everybody so that my mom could purchase what she needed. But it's true, like losing your mother tongue. My mom was trapped basically. She did her job as best she could, but she didn't have the language. She couldn't.
She did all right.
Yeah, she did all right in the English part, but so that really stuck out to me. But the when Hank was talking about the linguistic racism, and I cannot wait to find that article, but it's so true, where there's racism by your postal code.
Yes.
If you look at how real estate is sold.
The postal code discrimination. I work in an environment with homeless people, and I had to go get tested because one of the people were tested positive. So I was told to go right away and get the rapid testing.
Dolly Sinclair followed the specific instructions given to her and tried to book an appointment right away.
I gave my address. Are you still in East Preston? Yes, I am. Well, then you can wait and go. This was like on a Saturday. Or you can wait and go get tested on Monday. Excuse me? No, I have to go like now. So I said, you know what? You're supposed to be here to direct people to go. I've been advised by my boss in the Department of Health to go get tested. And you're telling me, as soon as you find out that I'm in Preston, you're going to tell me I can't get in till Monday?
So what do we do about it?
I mentioned my best friend in the world was a white male. He said to me, Dennis, I think I'm starting to get this stuff. Like, boy, it's been tough for you all the way around, And he goes, so how can I help? And I said to him, it's pretty simple. You've been a great friend. Here's what a friend does. A friend says to you when you're going to surgery, good luck. Hope you're okay. Let me know how this goes. Take care. Bye-bye. An ally, that's the word of the day. That's the newest word I know. Maybe there's a new one that I don't know about. But an ally says, well, can I take you? Can I be with you? Like, do you want me there? Do you want me to pick somebody up? Do you want me to pick your mother up to be there? You want me to pick your significant other, your partner up? How can I be involved to help make this better? That's what the world needs now in terms of people of color, people of trans, who happen to be of color. Can you imagine? Of color and trans, or gay, or something that could get you beat up out in society or mistreated, shoulder to shoulder. That's what we need next. Right now, you're looking at a middle-class Black man. I've made it. Woohoo, I'm middle class.
Talking about institutional racism, if you think about in health, those that are in social work, those that are in mental health, they're trained in a certain kind of way to understand the conditions. If they don't know those other racialized groups, what their health background would be, or what their stressors are, then they're going to get a misdiagnosis. I know here in Nova Scotia, it has taken almost 10 years for the medical profession to recognize sickle cell as something that could be seen as a preventative measure by just doing a simple test with mom and dad when their child was first born. And I think about mental health, where people who will look at mental health, they've gone through their certification, they've got all their degrees, they've got all their practices, but they run into problems when they're talking about people from our racialized communities that have a different setup in their lives, and how that notion of mental health manifests itself. It shows up differently. And if that's not understood by the profession, it means that we're going to get misdiagnosed or not even diagnosed at all. So this notion of institutional racism, sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it's totally unconscious, because the larger system is not aware of the other.
All of the panelists agreed the only solution is education, formal and informal education. But most education decisions are made by white people, so a lot has to change.
I've given presentations to organizations, and they walked out of the room. Once again, they said, we've never known, and cry. People cried. And it happens time and time again. And with the education, now, I find when it comes to education, there's treaty talks, treaty education, but is there anybody going back? Because a lot of times the information, it's almost like, here's what people could handle, but now that we've handled, put it out, can we go back and give them more and more and more and more? But sometimes also there's concepts that are out there, we're taught a certain way because this is what society can handle right now, or they're just taught in a colonialistic, systemic, racist way as well.
and also the acknowledgement of people being ancestral here, 400 years, not just that time frame, but what that means in terms of what was contributed in that length of time, the cumulative impact of that contribution, if it was fully valued, and the recognition of that impact.
For starters, I would talk about democracy. Many times people talk about democracy, that Greece is the seat of democracy. The seat of democracy is actually here on Turtle Island. And when we talk about republics and democracies, a lot of people point to the United States as a model of democracy and a republic, but that is modeled after the Haudenosaunee government, or what people call sometimes the Iroquois Confederacy, but it's the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And it was the founding fathers of the United States, Benjamin Franklin in particular, who studied the government of the Haudenosaunee and saw how it was run, that it was that government of the people, for the people, by the people, which he adopted for the United States and that they adopted.
And I'll only end off by saying that I don't think that the conversations should always be about people of African descent or people from the Indigenous community explaining what this is. I think it should be the reverse and say, what does whiteness mean to me? And how is my whiteness impactful to making the society either good or different?
We can get through this. We can become better people. Like I said, it's about caring. It's about remembering that we are all important. And I think the big thing is, how do I act? How do I behave around others? Do I treat everybody with respect? Do I, no matter what is going on, do I keep that person's dignity intact? Enemies of humanity are paternalism, are racism, colonialism, power, materialism, and that whole attitude, I think, of I'm just here for me. We forget we're here together. Again, it begins with education of our children and education in the schools, because we've gone from one extreme, which is indoctrinating them into a religion, to giving them almost nothing at all. We teach their minds, we work with their minds, we work with their physical selves. What we don't work with are the emotional and the spiritual.
Hank Middleton, a retired teacher, maintains that to teach underserved communities, schools need more autonomy.
Maybe 70s when I started teaching, if you graduated 40 to 45% of your Mi'kmaq students, you were doing okay. Because the system was not made for Mi'kmaq students. It was made for white students. It wasn't made for Acadian students, because Clara would tell you, you spoke French, but you went in with English books.
Now the Mi'kmaq run their own schools much more successfully.
And since they've run their own schools, their graduation rate is 89%. They teach recording arts. They teach culture. They do outdoor ed. They do stuff that is connected to the culture, which I would make the argument a lot of cultural groups and communities need to have the ability to do that.
Education's everything, but not just formal education. It's, you know what, it's the education we get from our parents. I think the number one thing that we get, that we learn from our parents and the people that are close to us.
When you think about your favorite teacher, do you remember what they taught you, or do you remember how they treated you? My favorite teacher always treated me with the utmost respect and made me feel like a human being.
As teachers, we have to remember we're not teaching subjects, we're teaching kids.
Yeah.
And it's people to people. And I think that's often forgotten because you get tied up in the humdrum of these are the outcomes that I have to teach and I need to get it out there regardless.
Clara and I ran the business for a fair amount of time. And I always assumed that you were teaching people, not subjects. And what happens in our system, I think we have to We have to start looking for the individual with empathy and get away from people that pass on information. We're at the point where, from a governmental point of view, and that's where a lot of our racism and discrimination comes from, we're so caught up in unstandardized scores, comparing this area with that area of Nova Scotia with New Brunswick, and New Brunswick with the rest of the world. I mean, I've been involved in stuff where we're comparing our kids with kids in the UK and Australia. That's not education. If you go back to traditional times, I'm sure in Mi'kmaq education, you taught people with empathy, you supported them along on their journey, and I'm sure the Mi'kmaq weren't comparing the education of their students with the Iroquois.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm positive of that. So we're really caught up in that, and we really have to get away from that. Start teaching individuals, and I'm not saying content and concepts and critical thinking are not important, but I don't think I have to be measured with somebody from British Columbia or Northern Ontario or Tennessee. I think that is one of the faults of our system.
The whole time you were talking, I kept thinking, why did I just learn about probably 80% of what you talked about I didn't know of? And I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in Nova Scotia, and I'm a full-fledged Acadian whose ancestors lived with the Mi'kmaq. Why is it that we don't know what you know and what your knowledge is? Why isn't that part of the education Department of Education system?
It's becoming that now. Actually, I have two groups that I teach from Department of Education.
I'm amazed that all of this richness is in Canada, and that we do have the ability to open our eyes, our hearts, our ears to people. We just have to continuously communicate, I think.
Until there is diverse representation in decision-making roles, systemic racism and discrimination will persist and keep hundreds of thousands of Canadians from reaching their true potential. And Canada is the poorer for it.
And so how do we try to elevate this so that the burden is not always on us? Because it is draining. It is really draining. So the high idea is to try to find more people that are, I don't want to call them allies, I want to call them accomplices. And if you're an accomplice, that means that you're on for the long haul and you're getting your hands and your feet and your whole self into this. And without that, I don't think that we're going to really make the advancement, because an ally can always say, yeah, I'm in, but there's a point in time where I'm out. But if I've got an accomplice, that means that they're with me from thick and thin. They're still there.
You simply cannot understand each other unless you have interactions with each other. And so, like, in my opinion, people from the Acadian community should be going to the Prestons, and people from the Prestons should be coming down the South Shore. And we should have events like that where people get to know each other in the same way that we're across the province and we're getting to know each other. And I would have to say, really like each other. Yeah. But we don't know each other, so we don't understand other cultures because we don't have that interaction.
We need more cross-cultural things by design. I mean, more groups of different cultures naturally meeting together.
There's a quote I love. It's a quote from Chief Orville Looking Horse. He says, "We are in this time and in this place to personally change the course of humankind. Do you think you were put here for something less?" I love that quote. And I think that's what we need to teach our children, that they are here for great things, but that they can change humankind.
We're more the same than we are different. And I think using those things, I mean, I'm cognizant of what I remember Wayne said, that it can't just be like a once and done kind of thing. So it would have to be a continual exchange, and just sort of making it building up a momentum or a critical mass where we can start to see a difference. And I think that would help.
And that's why I love that Mi'kmaq honor song, the last part of it. It says, for us to help each other in the way Creator intended when we were placed here on the earth. And I think that's what we need to do, and that's what we need to teach all our children, and giving them that future, a better future.
My word today is learning.
Say, I guess the way I'm feeling right now is enlightened.
I think my word would be history. And I'd add to that and say repeating itself.
I had two words. One, history was taken, but I'm going to use the word honesty.
I am here simply in the spirit of openness.
My word is hope.
That was my word. Hopeful. I'll add the full at the end.
And my word is understanding.
My word is acceptance.
And my word is energy.